So yeah, why don't we get going? Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Bob McGinnis, board member at the East End Seaport Museum. I hope everybody's well. We have a big group here today. We think that about 140 people registered between us and the North Fork Audubon Society. So yeah, and today's talk is sponsored actually by both the Seaport Museum and the North Fork Audubon Society. And it's a talk that's going to be given by John Holzapfel about the Menhaden, not the hotel in Greenport, but the fish. Fun fact, actually, the fish was actually named after the hotel and not the other way around, as many people assume. So a lot of people think it's the opposite. Is that right, John? Do I have that right?
The fish came first, I think.
Oh, okay. Just a few things before we get going. The presentation should last around 45 minutes. I'm going to mute you guys during the talk. So if you have a question, you can enter it in that chat window that comes up when you click on the little balloon at the bottom of your screen. And John will answer as many questions as he can at the end. So, but first, Paul Creeling, our board chair, is going to talk briefly about an upcoming event that we're having. So, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you for a sec.
Thank you, John. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm glad that we can have this meeting. It's terrific to share with programs. One of the good things that's happened during this pandemic is people have gotten outside. People have started to see a lot what's going on. And one of the things we saw was a huge Menhaden invasion, whatever. But we've also, with the North Fork Audubon Society, you get out and you see the birds and you see how it all connected. You go out and you walk the waterways and you see what's going on. It's a pretty good mix, I think, the two of us. So if you feel like joining organizations, join both. Now we have one of the problems coming up with that came up through this whole virus thing is the inability to raise funds. Well, one of the ways that the museum has chosen to do it is have these programs and invite you to join as a member, but also we're going to do, coming up very soon, like next week, we're going to have an art auction, an online art auction. It will be silent. You'll go in, you can bid on whatever. I've been asking the art community, as most organizations do, during the best of times. Now, it's not the best of times, and some of the artists are not being able to sell their work in the regular manner. So this was an opportunity for them. I structured it so that there's some benefit to the artists as well as to the museum. You will see when you go to the site and go to the link, which will be up this weekend, and you'll see how we structure it. And I've got over 20 artists and over 70 pieces of artwork. Many have contributed more than one. There is a huge talent pool out here. Maybe not as many as Bunker, but there's a lot of artists out here and a broad range of skills. Please go see it, sign up, see if you like anything. And it finishes on the 16th, which is 1 day after or 2 days after Valentine's Day. So maybe you can get your honey something really nice. Anyway, back to you, Bob, and the Menhaden.
Yes. So, yeah, there's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel here with this pandemic. So anything you can do, donate, join either of or both of our organizations, anything like that would be helpful as we kind of, run the last few yards. So, yeah, so back to John. John, just to introduce him a little, he has an undergraduate degree in chemistry and a master's degree in marine science. He taught high school science for 37 years and junior college science for 15 years, so he certainly knows his stuff. He served on 2 occasions as Southold trustee, town trustee, and also served as a member of Cornell Cooperative's Marine Advisory Board. When he retired from teaching, he began a shellfish company, and after 10 years, retired from the shellfish business. Over the past 7 years, John has been giving monthly talks on nature at Peconic Landing and as many of you may know, is a favorite speaker at the East End Seaport Museum. So, John, I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. And we'll get started. First of all, I have to thank both Audubon and the museum for asking me to give the talk. I enjoy doing it. And what we're going to do is talk about the many histories of the Menhaden. Now, there is so much material here. What I'm going to do is just scratch the surface, but there's a lot in this story. The first story, the first history we're going to talk about is the natural history. And this is what the Menhaden looks like. Brookesia tyrannus. There is another Gulf species that looks exactly the same almost, but slightly different. And it exists technically from Nova Scotia to West Palm Beach, but those are the extremes. There are two common, or actually three common names, but two of the common names, Pogie, not Porgy, not the Porgy, but Pogie, which is a word that's used from like Connecticut up the northeast coast, and Menhaden are both derived from Native American words. The first Pogie translates into fertilizer. And again, the second Menhaden is the modification of a word which means that which enriches the earth. So you can get an early picture of what Native Americans were using this fish for. This is what it looks like, common fish. It's also called, and probably the more common name around here, is bunker. It's just a small fish growing to little more than a foot, considered inedible. Now, I have friends who do eat them, but the secret is to eat them just as they come out of the water. They require a lot of oxygen. They need oxygen to stay alive. So if you put them in a bucket of water, they're dead in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, where you put killifish in a bucket of water and 4 hours later, they're still swimming around. So these are very sensitive, and they're very oily, and the oil gets rancid very quickly. They also have many bones, and they're also called bony fish by some of the early people that lived on the North Shore. It is by far, and this is surprising, the most abundant fish on the eastern coast of the United States. Most abundant. In many years, the catch exceeded the tonnage of all other fish caught. Now, again, think about that for a second. And most people don't even know what this fish is about. When the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries first started back in the 1880s, the first project they gave out was study of the Menhaden. And there's a book of 500 pages or so all about the fish. It was the most important fish at the time. A little bit of information. The Atlantic Menhaden is a member of the herring family. It is in the same role as the anchovies that you would have on the West Coast down along Peru, Chile. It's the same family of fish. And if we go through the fish quickly, it has a fairly large tail that propels it through the water. The bigger the tail, the faster the fish. Secondly, it has what's called oceanic camouflage. It's light on the bottom, dark on the top. If you're a fish underneath, it blends in with the sky. If you're an osprey up above, it blends in with the water. Third, it has invisible feelers. This is the so-called lateral line. The lateral line is a series of nerves running along the side of the fish, and they're pressure sensors. And these pressure sensors allow the fish to know exactly what the fish next to it is doing. And that's how those schools form and control themselves. They have these dots, put them out as a fairly clean identification mark. The yellowish tail and the yellowish fin also give it some identification. Breathing, they have rather large gills, They have dim eyes. The eyes, because they're a schooling fish, they're not looking for a predator. They're not looking for someone to catch up. They're relying on the whole school to protect them. So their eyes aren't as keen as some others. And then finally, they have a vacuum cleaner mouth. We look at this picture. This is how they travel through their lives, with their mouth wide open. They don't have any teeth. They can't bite anything. You can't hook them directly. They're not going to bite on bait. They are used to strain plankton from the water. Inside, there's what's called gill rakers, and this is like a filter. It's a basket that efficiently captures tiny food. One fish can filter about 7,500 gallons a day. And this is what the gill rakers look like under a microscope. And basically, it's a filter. It'll trap microscopic algae, green plants, even animals too, that are living in the water. So as the water flows through their mouth over the gill rakers, they capture this microscopic food. Now, one role of the menhaden in nature is its role as a filter feeding, that's what I just spoke about, primary consumer. And that's the part I want to talk about now. Hopefully, we all understand that all our food comes from the sun. The sun carries on or allows plants to carry on photosynthesis. Everything living, almost 99.9%, depend upon the sun for their food. So if you're eating rice, wheat, corn, any of these things, they're all green plants. If you're having chickens, they ate the green plants. If you're having cows, they ate the green plants. You get the idea that everything comes through the green plants, and the sun is what energizes the green plants. But there has to be a connection in the oceans between the green plants and the rest of animal life. So this is what's called a food pyramid or an energy pyramid. And on the bottom, always the widest part is, in this case, the green plants. Algae, phytoplankton, light plankton, microscopic little things. But they are capturing the energy of the sun. They're making proteins, they're making carbohydrates, they're making fats inside themselves. But now to translate that and move it along the chain, there has to be filter feeders. And that's the role of menhaden. Menhaden swim through this microalgae and they adapt it, change it into their own protein, their own carbohydrates, their own fats. And so now they've taken the energy of the sun and moved it up one more trophic level, they're called. And then obviously those fish are eaten by other fish. These are carnivores because they're eating the fish. And you have a secondary carnivore and up the pyramid. Here is a picture that demonstrates it. You see the school of menhaden in the middle, and you see striped bass, you see weakfish, you see some birds even diving down, whales and osprey, and even people fishing. So you get the idea that the menhaden provide the food for much of the other species. Here's a great example of a menhaden being swallowed by a striped bass. And this is a little story. Does it what I just said?
These little fish feed much of the other fish and wildlife in the ocean around them. Striped bass and bluefish, humpbacks and other whales and dolphins, osprey and terns, even sharks. All these animals and more depend on menhaden for survival. These little fish scoop up plankton, turn it into protein and fat, and send that energy up through the ocean food chain.
So again, if we go back to that original book all about the menhaden, Professor Good is the author of the book. The Menhaden's place in nature is not hard to surmise, and he summarizes their mission is undoubtedly to be eaten. That's their role in life. He further quoting him, when he brings upon his table bluefish, bonitos, weakfish, swordfish, bass, codfish, what is he eating? Usually nothing but Menhaden. So you can see the importance of this fish. As they filter plankton from the water to eat, they are also acting to clean the water. So they're filtering out the algae. As I said earlier, an adult fish filters a lot of water. One adult fish can filter about 2 million gallons of water every year. Now you might have 100, 200, 300,000 fish in one little school. So multiply all those numbers and you'll see how they have a role of cleaning out the water also. Here's a great example of what could happen. On the bottom, you see Moriches Bay. This is brown tide of a few years ago. You could put your hand in the water and see maybe 6 inches down. And you can notice the ocean right next to it, a beautiful bluish green color. So again, these fish can have a role in eating some of these algae blooms up. So as they filter plankton from the water, they are acting to clean the water. They're trapping the energy from the primary producers. So the green plants, they're putting them into themselves, and they are acting as food for many other fish. And that's why Menhaden is supposedly the most important fish in the sea. And there's a book by Bruce Franklin called The Most Important Fish in the Sea. And a lot of this talk is based on some of the stuff in his book. If you don't have it, it's well worth reading. It's maybe 6 or 8 or 9 years old by now. Back to the natural history. And I'm going to start in January, February. That's where we are now. The masses schools are down off North Carolina and Virginia. Now, again, there are stragglers down further, but the mass of the fish are down off here, and they begin to reproduce. They're out off the coast and relatively close, 5, 10, 15 miles. They can be along the coast, and they produce. The eggs are released. They float into the creeks, the bays, and those eggs will develop in the protected waters. As time goes on, the waters get warmer, the fish begin to migrate north. And again, they'll reproduce. The eggs will work their ways into the marshes and the bays of Delaware, New Jersey. As time goes on, they eventually make it up. April and May, the waters have warmed up enough, and they come up and they go by us. They spend some time definitely feeding and enjoying all local waters. And in the good old days, here's one small school being attacked, obviously from below by somebody, and it just jumping out of the water to escape. As I was going to say, in the good old days, they used to make it around Cape Cod, and I'm talking about 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. They began to make it around Cape Cod. The bigger fish, particularly bigger tails, could swim faster. The schools sort of locate themselves according to size. So some of the bigger schools would make it up and around all the way up to Maine. And then at some point, this map, I always like to say this, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, this is a map of 1878, and it tells you when the fish arrive. So if you are not familiar when they arrive in Long Island, you're only 140 years behind the times, because everybody knew when they came that long ago. And they tell you when they come, when they leave. And again, this is from the book that I was talking about before. These are little peanuts. The little guys will develop in the bays and in the creeks. And at the end, they'll start going down and they'll start to migrate south again. And we lose ours sometime around November, December. I was out in November, and I think Paul was saying earlier that the entire area was filled. You could almost walk on the water. There were so many of them. They stretched from Greenport all the way over to Shelter Island, all the way down to Southold, all the way out to Orion. And the schools were just gigantic. And they migrate down in January when they're back down south, and the cycle starts again. Now, that's a little bit of the natural history. Now we're going to talk about how do you catch menhaden? What's the history of that? First, weirs. And a weir is just a blockage across a creek or an opening. And the tide would come in. And as the tide came in, it would overflow this. And as the tide goes out, the fish would be trapped behind it. You drop your net into the water and you could scoop up the fish that were trapped. Also, the early ways of harvesting them were nets. The pound net is probably one of the oldest. This is a picture of a pound net. And just very quickly, you've probably seen them out in the water and not sure of how they actually work. But over on the left-hand side, you'll see the letter A is the crib or the pound. And then in the middle, you'll have a heart, which is actually a net in the shape of a heart that funnels the fish into the crib. And then you have a leader or a hedging that is a long straight net that leads the fish offshore. So again, if we look at it diagrammatically and with the use of higher graphics, you'll see the menhaden start swimming along. They bump into the net. They're blocked. They go to deeper water. They're funneled into the heart. The heart funnels them back and funnels them into the pound. And you would go out every day, every other day, and the pound would be fished out. This is what it looks like in real life. Down on the bottom, just in the very bottom of the picture would be the pound. You can see the heart structure here, and you can see the lead going all the way into shore, blocking an escape that way, forcing them out into the pound. Now that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Another way to hunt them is gill nets, canoes, small ships. A gill net, just what it says. The fish swims in, it can't get through, it's trapped by its gills, it can't back out, and you lift it up to the surface and you pull the fish out. Gill nets, you'll see the buoys for them out in the bay. And it's just what it looks like. Here's somebody sampling what's in the water. It's a good way to find out what's out there. So the government is sensing what kind of fish are in this area. Some trivia, though, about gill netting. And this is called ghost fishing. Now, we're not talking about fishing for ghosts. This is ghost fishing. These are nets that are abandoned, and they will trap things that aren't intended to be trapped. Gear that is lost through storms or for other reasons can continue to catch birds and fish, so if it breaks loose. Recently, it is not uncommon to have gill nets or ocean drift nets. Now listen to this carefully, 30, 60, or even 80 miles in length. So they'll have these plastic nets 80 miles long that are just sunk down to a certain depth, and they're floating in the ocean. If one breaks away, then they simply fish forever until the plastic is very hard to break down, as you all know. So these are used in the open ocean to catch tuna, salmon, squid, many other fish. However, ghost fishing is a major hazard of gill nets. And if we can just look at this, 640 tons of fishing gear is lost. 1/10 of that, 1/10 of the plastic waste is fishing gear. And it threatens the ocean wildlife. So let's respect our oceans. This is ghost fishing. And what you see up on the left hand is the nets. They're very light, floats on the top, weights on the bottom. And as I say, they can stretch for miles and miles, and they just trap anything and everything. So that's the end of a little trivia. Continuing. Now we have seines working from the shore. And this was the classic 1800s to 1850s methods of catching them. What would happen is they'd usually hire some kid to sit down on the bluffs or on the beach and look out. And when you saw it, that's a school of Menhaden. Tens and hundreds of thousands of fish in there. The kid would ring a bell. The farmers would all leave their land and run down to shore. The first team that got there to shore would set out in 2 boats. And one person would be letting out the net, 2 people rowing. And what they would do, if you look on each side of the picture, you can see they're encircling that same school that you just saw in that movie. And they're encircling it. And the other guys in the front of the picture are waiting their turn. They were late. And there was a real honor system of whoever got there first and were allowed to go out and catch them. So here you can see the people are rowing down into shore, and there's a line that's attached around a capstan on the shore. And you can see there's other posts all along the shore where they might be using them. And there's a horse, and the horse is just going around in a circle. But as he goes around in the circle, he pulls that line tighter and tighter, pulling in the net and all the fish. So that at some point, they're all in shallow water. The men get up and they harvest, put them in a wagon, and carry them away. And as we'll find out, they're carrying them away to their farm fields. Now, eventually it got harder and harder to find schools close to shore. So they started to use what are called purse seines. The first use was in 1845 by Rhode Islanders, but it really didn't catch on until another few years. But it was the single greatest advance in catching Menhaden. The purse seine was not widely used until the 1870s, when it led to the development of the purse boat, one of several technical improvements that made the eventual emergence of a more efficient means to catch Menhaden. And this is a theme that's constantly going through this talk, more and more efficient means, as you've noticed. The purse seine simply had corks on the top and weights and rings on the bottom. And in those rings was a line. And if you can mentally think of it, if you start pulling that line on the bottom tighter and tighter, the net is pulled in and will trap the fish. So here you can be offshore now. You don't have to be on shore. And you can see the net is put around the school of fish. And then slowly but surely, the bottom is pulled tighter and tighter. Maybe this picture might show it a little better. You see the weights on the bottom, lead line, which simply means a heavy thing, the rings themselves, and a wire running through the rings. So that wire is tighter and tighter, and it just closes off the bottom so the fish can't escape from there. So you can then go wherever the fish are. This is from the 1930s, 40s, maybe early 50s. And you can see there's a dozen or so men, and they're pulling the net tighter and tighter. What happened, though, in the 1950s is all of that was replaced with 2 men in a boat, 2 boats, and what's called a haul seiner that just simply mechanized the whole process. You could wrap your line around that and pull the whole thing in all by itself. So it really cut down on the number of people doing the job. And then if you add an airplane to a factory boat, you have the ultimate way to catch every Menhaden that's out there. And this is a picture of Omega Protein, the one factory that still is catching them, or was still catching them, I'll say. My point in all of this is fishing effort is how hard it is to catch the fish, how much energy you have to put in, hours, whatever. And the bottom line is it's just got easier and easier and easier with fish finders, with planes. All of that just allowed the fishing to take in almost every single Menhaden if they wanted to. Another history. How were Menhaden used? Well, why are we catching them? First is fertilizer, but underlying all of this, whenever we talk about uses, you have to understand it's always to make money. People are catching these fish to make money. That's the reason. Again, some trivia here. We all know, probably have heard of Squanto. This is the Native American who walked out of the woods and told the pilgrims to plant 2 fish with their corn and their beans, and everything will grow fine. Just as a trivial point, Squanto had been to Europe. He was captured, brought to Spain, lived there for a couple of years, and then was moved over to England, lived in England for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and learned English. So it wasn't that this was just somebody stepping out of the woods and saying, let me tell you, pilgrims, this is what to do. Squanto was very familiar with the English people. Again, a little more trivia. Now, when we think of, and I'm talking 1700s, 1750s, going into the 1800s, people lived by subsistence. They grew their own vegetables, their own food, chickens, geese, whatever it might be. It was a subsistence garden. However, when the towns began to get a little bit bigger, they went not from subsistence, but to monoculture. And monoculture is the demise of soil. It just sucks out the same nutrients year in and year out, so that after 2 or 3 years of just growing corn, it just wouldn't grow. Things looked terrible, that they just didn't have the proper nutrients. So one of the things that happened, this is from a book by Gabriel about Long Island. By the end of the 18th century, scanty crops and thinning meadows had begun to tell the story of the exhaustion which had come to the farmlands of New England and Long Island. Desperate for nitrogen and phosphorus, the major ingredients in fertilizer, American farmers were forced to import large quantities of quite pricey guano, bird droppings. So they would actually pay for these bird droppings to be brought up here and spread out on their farms. Luckily, a local, Ezra Lahamadou, you might know the street, he was an American lawyer, statesman from Southold. He was a delegate in New York to the Continental Congress, and again in 1788. His first wife was the sister of William Floyd. Now, why do I mention him? In 1792, he went up to Albany and published an article. And in this article, he said, experiments made by using the fish called Menhaden or moss bunkers as a manure have succeeded beyond all expectation. And he goes on to say how this should be done, how many fish per acre, et cetera, et cetera. So again, quoting Gabriel, numbers help, but give little in giving an idea of the steady rise of the fishery. The hundreds of thousands of fish that were caught in the early years of the 19th century grew to millions when the first quarter had been passed. These in turn became hundreds of millions as the half-century mark approached. So here you can see the first development of the industry. Why are they hunting them? It's fertilizer. They would put them out on the fields. Now they stunk like crazy. Sometimes they were plowed in, sometimes they were just let to rot. It was not a pleasant odor. In the rejuvenating of the impoverished soil of Long Island, the long neglected moss bunker played a leading part. And these are the fish, and as I said, they were placed out in the fields. It wasn't long before millions of tons of menhaden were caught and dragged as far as 7 miles inland, dumped on fields, which saved farmers this enormous cost. And so you remember what I was saying earlier, where the farmers would go out, the bell would ring, they'd all leave their farms, run down to catch these. This was their fertilizer. For over 200 years, beginning in 1792, the Menhaden fishery has been the largest commercial fishery in the United States. The large-scale commercial use of menhaden as fertilizer began this industry and is the first major event in the development of the menhaden industry. And I'm advertising this took place right here in Southold. So again, a little bit of local history. Continuing. The history of the uses. These are more uses, oil and fertilizer. And again, what's underlying it? To make money. That's why these fish should be caught, to make money. I told you at the beginning that the fish was an oily fish, and that became a problem when you kept fertilizing with these fish. The soil became caked and oily, and it lost its ability to grow well. So it wasn't a permanent solution to the problem. Another part, so that oil in the soil was a problem, and there was no oil in the lamps. What's happening is 1840s were the high time for whaling. They would go out and they would spend 1.5 years or 2 years catching the whales, boiling it down and producing whale oil, which was a great source of light. And so what happened in the 1850s and 60s now is that the whales had been hunted out, and they found out that this oily fish could be squeezed and that the oil could be used. Just as an example, I'll get back to it later, but whalers would go out for 1.5 years, 2 years, and they would come back with a hull full of oil. If you went out from Greenport for 2 weeks, caught menhaden, and brought it back in and squeezed it down, you had the same amount of oil. 2 years versus 2 weeks. So you can see the profit. Now, what am I talking about? What's happening here? Well, this is a primitive oil processing facility. What they did is they heated under pressure, squeezed the fish, heated the fish, and you were able to squeeze out the oil. The 1850s brought the next extremely important change to the East Coast menhaden fishery. And once again, it occurred on the North Fork of Long Island, local history. For some years, and there's arguments of who did it first and everything else, but we'll be prejudiced here. For some years, a few people had been trying with indifferent results to extract oil from bunkers by boiling them in whalers' trypots. In 1850, Wells, D.D. Wells, built on the shore, and this is, I'm quoting, in the shore near Greenport. Actually, it was on Shelter Island. They didn't want to say that. The first menhaden oil factory ever seen on the Atlantic coast. These were smelly, ugly places. And this is a picture of a bigger one. And this is out at Napeague, Promised Land. You can see the size of the containers where they're actually boiling, squeezing them down, producing the oil. Now, at the same time, after you squeeze the oil out, these fish were left behind, the bones, the protein, the other parts of it. And let me back up a little bit. As a producer of commercial oil, the menhaden would take a high rank, both in the quantity and in the quality. It produced a very good light, a very, very good light. You could, in fact, people were selling menhaden oil as whale oil or mixing half and half at the time. In 1874, the yield of menhaden oil on the Atlantic coast was over 3 million gallons, nearly equal to the aggregate of all the whale, seal, and cod oil made in America. By 1876, 500 million menhaden were being processed each year in 99 factories up and down the coast. Menhaden supplanted whale oil, as I said, after the Civil War because overfishing had made whale oil scarce. By the late 1800s, Menhaden oil was no longer used. Why? Pennsylvania. They discovered oil coming out of the ground. So now there's a whole new industry, and where Menhaden oil is not as cheap. It's easier to do it the other way. So the use of Menhaden for oil, for lubricants, all of these things began to decrease. What I was going to say is the refuse left after the oil had been expressed was also utilized. This scrap, as it was called, was dried, pulverized, and made into a fertilizer of great value that's sold among the farmers of the eastern states as guano. Now, this is a factory over in Milford. You can see the size of that factory. And if you look at close up, this is the area where they would put everything out to dry. It was a smelly, smelly business. Here, some of you might recognize this picture if you've ever been to Orient State Park. This factory that you see here was out where the state park is. Rather large factory, as you can see. And what was it? At one point, it's called the Atlantic and Virginia Fertilizing Company. And it was out at the point. Another time, the same factory is called Eureka, part of the Atlantic and Virginia Fertilizing Factory. It had a half a dozen different names. Menhaden was just so abundant and so easy to catch on America's Atlantic coast that it was, for a while, cheaper to use them than all the other widely available animal, vegetable, and mineral fertilizers. So it was just the dried fertilizer was a real moneymaker. But as soon as the chemical processes of the early 20th century were able to synthesize cheaper fertilizers, that this part of the Menhaden industry was wiped out completely. Today, Menhaden is used no longer sources of raw materials for farming, manufacturing, but now omega-3 supplements. It's a billion-dollar industry, but they are in competition with lots of other sources. And they're also used as feed for factory farm fish and livestock. That's what it's come down to. And there's your omega-3. This graph, where do Menhaden go? On the left, 72% of omega protein, that's the company, revenue comes from Menhaden protein processed into animal feed. And on the right, it comes into animal feed and omega-3 pills. Just to give you, that's what it's down to. So to review, in the early 1800s, they took the fish right from the ocean, from the bay, close by, brought them up, put them in wagons, spread them on the farm fields. In the 1850s, they decided to separate the oil from the fish. So now you had a clean oil you could use for lights, and you had fertilizer. And then finally, in the 20th century, there were some industrial, there were ingredients of paint and all sorts of, there's a list of 50 different things that they were part of. But all of that has been replaced by modern chemistry. And then finally, in the 21st century, it's down to omega-3 and animal feed. So that's how it's been one of the uses. Now here's another use. Remember that Menhaden's other role in the energy cycle. They are food for the secondary consumers. And this is a great picture showing that striped bass love to eat bunker. And they'll take them whole fish, they just swallow them. And it's a great picture showing the relationship. Historically, Menhaden were used as bait fish in the cod and other ground industries. At a time when handline mackerel fishery was what is at its height, they used slivered Menhaden. And here's a picture that showed it, okay? They just slice it off and that was the bait. Today, commercial fishermen still use Menhaden. The local trap people will sell them off to Connecticut, Rhode Island as bait for their lobster traps. And you'll fill it up. And here you see recreational fishermen also use ground Menhaden, couple of companies grind it up. They have different formulas, shark formula or whatever, and they'll use it as a fish attractant, chum. So that's another use. Now we get to a critical part of it, the history of overfishing Menhaden. Remember I said the fish migrate up along the East Coast. The bigger fish would make it the furthest up because they have the biggest tail, the biggest strength, and they would be up. So if the industry was going to start to process Menhaden, they started at the biggest fish. So if we look at this distribution of Menhaden factories, 1877, there are 18 of these factories in Maine. Why? Because that's where the biggest fish are. Massachusetts, 4. Connecticut, 14, 31, 16. You see the numbers. 30-something years later, Maine is down to 1. Massachusetts has none. Connecticut has 2. And this is only in 1912. But notice what happens down at the bottom. Virginia and North Carolina have increased their factories. And what they're doing, I'll get to this again, but I just a preface to it, is what they're doing is they're cutting off the fish right down in Virginia and North Carolina. They're not letting them get up any further. They're hunting them right away. And that's why it's leading to the demise of the northern fish. In the 1920s, there were 38 factories processing Menhaden. By 1955, there were 14. By 1997, only 3 existed on the East Coast. And just very quickly, this is a complicated graph, but it just shows down on the bottom left, if you look Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, there's basically no harvest in the 50s. It's over, and it stays that way all the way across. If we look at New York, New York has a harvest because they have a couple of factories that are still working. Same thing with Delaware. They have a couple of factories that are still working. But you see by the 1960s, those numbers are going down. New Jersey also, they're all going down. They close Promised Land, which is out in Amagansett, near Montauk. They close Lewis, Delaware. So these 2 big factories, the last 2 on the Northeast, these are closed. So all of a sudden, Jersey goes up a bit and holds itself for a while, but then drops off. But here's the other side. As these are all dropping off, Virginia is going up and up and up and is catching the fish as they're still very young. To give you an idea, in the older times, New York, Mid-Atlantic would catch 3-year-old fish and a very few 2-year-old. Whereas if you go down to Chesapeake Bay, they were catching 1-year-old fish and 2-year-old fish. They would catch them as soon as they got out. Some got away and made it up the East Coast and were caught as 3-year-olds, but it was rare. Only 6% of the catch in the Chesapeake are 3 years or more. So again, I've said before how efficient it became. They could catch every fish that they wanted. So as we saw earlier with the advent of mechanized purse seines, larger, more powerful boats, electronic advances, spotter planes, you get the idea. It became possible to catch almost all the Menhaden, and that's what happened. Presently on the US coast, there's only 1 factory, Omega Protein. Last year, they were closed down for a while because they had broken the quotas that had been in place. Just to give you an idea, the catch went down, the effort went down, it just became easier. Almost 3/4 of all the Menhaden caught on the East Coast are harvested by Omega Protein. Now, there are local people, as I said, will go out in Massachusetts, catch a few off Jersey coast and bring them back for bait. But most of them are caught by this one company. And this was an interesting chart I found. It applies to Chesapeake Bay, but I suspect it might also have applied to us up here. 70%, the amount of adult rockfish. Rockfish is what they call striped bass. So if you're down in Chesapeake, striped bass is called a rockfish. So 70% of their diet was menhaden. Today, 8%. The rockfish population is showing signs of malnutrition and increasing mortality. There's just not enough food. The amount in osprey nestlings diet filled by menhaden in the 1980s, 75%. Today, what is it? 28%. 65%, the annual removal of adult menhaden from East Coast waters. And 8% is the current Atlantic menhaden population compared against historical levels. So I just think the numbers give you some indication of what's going on. And this is the factory that is responsible for most of it. Recently, just last year, US Secretary of Commerce shut down omega protein because it exceeded a fishing cap. And here's another interesting thing. From the very beginning, I'll read this first. The Virginia House and Senate have passed bipartisan legislation to transfer management of Virginia's menhaden fisheries from the General Assembly. For all these years, the elected officials controlled only the menhaden industry. They didn't control striped bass, they didn't control duck hunting, they didn't control any other fisheries or nature things. The only thing they controlled were the menhaden industry, and they voted all the time to allow people to fish as much as they wanted. But last year, they shifted it over finally to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. So that was a major change. And the other thing that has happened is that the government has stepped in, and the new quotas are not based on just how many fish you have, but also how that fish interrelates with the rest of the environment. It's a very major breakthrough that just happened. Another history of the menhaden, fish kills. These are all menhaden, and I can show you 100 pictures like this of dead fish just washed up on the shore. This happened to be Meeting House in Reeves Creek. New York State DEC has determined the fish were almost exclusively menhaden, known as bunker. Estimated numbers of fish killed in the hundreds of thousands. The event appears to be a natural occurrence. The extent of the kill appears limited to Meeting House Creek and Reeves Creek and the adjacent areas, including Indian Island, Suffolk County. Now, if you look at the map, you realize and know that this is the end of Peconic Bay. It's a very narrow opening down there. And the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water in this area sometimes becomes very, very low. And you might recall at the beginning of the talk, I said these fish are on the surface, they need oxygen, they're highly dependent. And what happens is they swim into very warm water. And that warm water, think of a warm beer or a warm soda, all the bubbles it goes flat very quickly. Those bubbles are dissolved carbon dioxide in beer, but in water, it's oxygen. So the amount of oxygen in hot water is very, very little. And when you have this whole school of fish swimming in there, they're all breathing and using up the oxygen. They actually suffocate and die off. And that's what causes these large kills. High water temperature means low concentration of oxygen, and they actually can't breathe. So the bays and estuaries they inhabit now often have very low levels of dissolved oxygen due to temperature, pollution, and ironically enough, the fish are frequently drawn to their doom by following their natural instincts toward the most algae-filled waters, precisely where the oxygen content is most depleted, because the algae begin to die off. And as they die off, they use up the oxygen in the water. So again, that's fish kills. And finally, I think the local history of menhaden. And again, I hinted at this story, and it's a review to some extent. The first fishermen were mainly farmers who went out in boats to take the fish when they should appear. As the demand increased, companies were organized, devoting their whole time during the season to the capture of bunkers. The most important possession of each organization was a huge seine, sometimes 3/4 of a mile in length. Now compare that to 80-mile nets that are out in the ocean. And again, I've shown you this picture where the two boats go out, surround the field. And this would be the home, the base along the coast. A small weathered board shack on the beach was called headquarters. And in this, most of the meager equipment was stored. When all was done, a heap of glistening bunkers, perhaps 100,000 or more, would lie piled up on the sand. And that would be the result of just one small school going by. There are stories of these schools being miles long. I mentioned Augustus Griffith. This is his diary from 1792 to 1852. He tells what happens almost on every day. And in it, there are numerous references. And he first mentions Menhaden in 1820. The seines caught only 13,000 bony fish. Another time, his diary over the next 30 years continues to note the catches. For example, on June 17th, 1840, he recounts our two seines, Jackson and Union. And if you look out there, there are two seines now that are almost in the same positions. These have taken together 900,000 shad up to this date. I'll read the top of this. The following is a statement of bunkers that were taken in the waters of the town of Southold during the season of 1835. And this is the assessors. Now on the left is the name. Some of the names are the Coots, the Caves, the Crows, the Hawks, and I've covered two, Jackson, out in Orient. 2.8 million fish were caught during that year. Continuing the list, the Skunks, you know where they were from, the Little Jackson up on the top, and the Union, another Orient one. The bottom line is, when you add all those numbers up, Southold town took 30 million fish. Now just think, Riverhead, East Hampton, Southampton, Shelter Island, and that's just the tip of the North Fork. Go down along the whole Great South Bay, Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island. You can imagine the number of fish that were being caught. So as we've discussed, this first phase of Menhaden, the shore nets to the farm fields lasted from the 1790s to the 1850s. By 1857, there were only 3 fishing companies left, and the industry was reinventing itself into the oil and guano field and entering the factory. The first factories, as I said, appeared in 1850s. There were at least 15 factories in Greenport, Southold, and Shelter Island. And again, all of these factories they tried to put them as far away as possible. For instance, on Long Beach, out by the Orient State Park, promised land where nobody lived at that time. Again, here is a list of some of the factories on the eastern end in 1873. And you'll mention, if you look at it, some of the names that are very common: Horton, Rainier, Glover, Clark, Wells. And I put a little box around the 2 boats that I told you about. They would go out and catch the bunker and come back with the same amount of oil that a whaler would come back with in 2 years. Here's local. This is Orient Point, boiling and pressing the fish at Orient. This is in 1879. Again, this picture I showed you about the Atlantic and Virginia Fertilizing Company, how big it was. And it was out there on Long Beach. From 1865 to 1895, a fish factory, whether the Atlantic Oil and Guano, the Atlantic and Virginia Fertilizing, Orient Guano Company, all sorts of names, processed Menhaden into oil and fertilizer, and they operated where the Orient State Park is now located. They made a lot of money for a lot of people. This is an interesting, again, a little trivia point. Long Island Traveler Watchman, 1880. This reporter could have read the local news while standing in the field in front of his residence in Orient, between 3 and 4 miles from the fire. Without doubt, 100 persons in our village depended upon Long Beach for support. So you see the size and importance of this factory. And it burnt down. It was replaced with this factory, which is somewhat smaller, which also burnt down in the next year or two. And then finally, by the turn of the century, this is what's left. It was a wreck, a hulking wreck. This is a William Steeple Davis photo in 1898. And if you look carefully way over here, you'll see the original bug light standing out there, guiding their way into Greenport. Another part of the story is in the after the war in 1950s, 60s, there was the famous bunker fleet. Menhaden fishing remained a big business, and bunker boats continued to ply out of Greenport. Now, they were bringing the fish into New Jersey, or they were bringing them out to Promised Land. The fishery had moved, but these are bunker boats. They would go out, spy the schools of fish, and surround them. Some final trivia. Miss Pam. I just think this is an interesting trivial point. In the book, Hotels and Inns of Long Island, if you don't have it, you should get it. It's wonderful. It's done by Jeff Fleming and Amy Folk, who is the town historian and the archivist for Oyster Ponds and Southold Historical Societies. And in it, I'm just going to quote, an interesting consequence of the bunker boat business. Quote, in those days, Greenport Village had its own police force, and it was all too happy to see the likes of Madam Pam, one of the most notorious madams, open up shop. The reason behind this was simple. It was a time when the fishing industry in the village was booming, and many young men came to work on what were called bunker boats. After a hard day's work, all of these young men had nothing to do, and many fights ensued in the village. The establishment of Madam Pam and her like did two things. One, it kept the boys busy and out of trouble when they were not on the boats. And two, the money the ladies took from the boys' paychecks was inevitably put right back into the community during those tough times. At least one resident, Dr. J. Mott Heath, received compensation from them. He was a prominent physician and is known to have looked after the medical needs of Madam Pam's many female employees. And I think this is the most interesting. Her influence could even be felt in death when the town's supervisor, Albert Martoccia, gave the eulogy at her funeral. End of some more trivia. There are two books, one I mentioned earlier, The Most Important Fish in the Sea, and the other one, The Last Days of the Menhaden Industry. That's by Amy Folk again, and it's a lot of pictures all about it. And I think that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. That was, John, that was fascinating. That was amazing.